So this lecture's the first in the second section of the textbook that we're going to cover, which is all about interactions. And this particular lecture covers chapter 13, and it's all about competition. So this is a broad breakdown of what's included in the lecture. So first of all, we're going to talk about what is competition. So we'll define competition. Then we'll talk about ways that we can categorize competition. So what are the different types of competition? We'll look at some evidence for competition in natural settings. We'll look briefly at some mathematical models for competition, so predicting the effect of competition on populations. Then we'll look at laboratory models of competition, so predicting the effects on populations based on lab experiments. Then we'll look at the competitive exclusion principle. This is the idea that similar species that are similar in their ecology, that are competing for resources, won't be able to coexist. Eventually, the most competitive one will outcompete the other one. So we'll look into that and determine whether that's true. Then we're going to look at competition and niches. So how does competition affect the niche of species and populations? And then finally, we're going to look at character displacement. This is the idea that competition can actually drive evolution in species. So first of all, what is competition? Well, competition can take many forms, and that's something we'll come on to in a few slides' time. But the broad definition is it's a form of interaction, an antagonistic form of interaction, in which all individuals are harmed. So both parties of the interaction get a negative from the interaction. So compare this to other common types of interactions. So predation and herbivory. A predator or a herbivore gets a positive out of that interaction. They get food for nourishment. The plant or the prey animal that's being preyed upon obviously comes out quite badly from that interaction, so that's a negative. And a very similar relationship can be seen in parasitism. Mutualisms are interactions where both parties get a positive out of the interaction. So a good example of this might be nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So these are bacteria that take up residence in the roots of plants, and they fix atmospheric nitrogen, which the plants can then take up and use. And in return, these bacteria get carbohydrates that the plants produce through photosynthesis. Another kind of interaction is a commensalism. So this is where one party gets a positive out of the interaction and one party is unaffected by the interaction, so it's neutral. So an example of a commensalism might be a large tree providing nesting space for birds and homes for squirrels. So those birds and squirrels benefit hugely from that nesting space, but the tree is unaffected. It's neither negatively or positively affected by the interaction. An amensalism is a similar kind of interaction, but where one organism gets, or one party has a negative from the interaction, and one party is neutral, so there's no negative or positive. So an example of this might be some small plants at ground level being shaded out by a large canopy tree. So the canopy tree is unaffected by the interaction, that's neutral, but the small plants on the forest floor are negatively affected by that interaction. And the final kind of interaction is a neutralism. This is where two organisms exist in the same space, but are just completely unaffected by one another. So competition can be categorized in a couple of different ways, but the most common way we look at it is as intraspecific competition and interspecific competition. So intraspecific competition is competition between individuals of the same species, whereas interspecific competition is competition between individuals of different species. The other way that we categorize competition is more to do with the nature of the interactions themselves. So one type would be interference competition, and this is where there's kind of direct aggressive interactions between individuals. So often this could be interactions between territorial animals. The second type is exploitative competition. So this is where individuals interact indirectly through the use of shared resources. So plants competing for light, or animals competing for food. So a good example of interference competition would be competition or aggressive competition between male damselfish for territory space. So work's been done on this on coral reefs just off the coast of Jamaica, and these fish have territories of just under a metre squared that contain basically everything they need, from refugia to defend themselves from predatory fish, and also abundant algae to feed on. But not all male damselfish have a territory, so the ones that do are constantly under threat of attack from other males trying to take over that territory. And this is quite aggressive behaviour, obviously between individuals of the same species. But if you remove a damselfish from its territory, very quickly that territory will be taken up maybe by another damselfish, but maybe by other territorial reef fish. And so these damselfish are engaging not only in interference competition with their own species, so intraspecific competition, but also with members of other species, so interspecific competition. So this is an example of exploitative competition. This is where organisms interact with each other indirectly through competition for resources. So this example shows a forest of white pines. And these large mature trees obviously take up a lot of nutrients from the soil. And one of the first things you can notice about these forests is that there are very few young trees and very few other plants growing at ground level. And that's because it's very difficult for those individuals to establish themselves when they're competing with these large mature trees for resources. Something that experimenters did in these forests was to kind of dig square trenches within the forest, whereby they would cut through all of the roots in kind of metre deep trenches. So in the middle of those squares, what they found was that young trees and other plants grew much more successfully when they weren't competing with the root mass of these large mature trees. So what is the evidence for the incidence of competition in natural settings? So one common example of this that can be seen very clearly is the intraspecific competition in plant populations. And this we have a term for this, which is self-thinning. So basically, as a stand of trees develops, more and more of the biomass of that population is composed of fewer and fewer individuals. So this graph on the right shows that relationship between number of individual plants on the x-axis and the log of individual mass on the y-axis. So as that stand of trees develops, you can see that naturally more and more, or a higher and higher proportion of the biomass is taken up by fewer individuals. And this is something that's driven by competition. So essentially, as the trees grow, they take up more and more nutrients, they absorb more and more light, and some of those individuals compete more successfully than others. And as they do, they get bigger and bigger, and some of those other individuals can't keep up, and many of them die. And this is something we see not only in large trees, but also in annual plants as well. When we sow seeds in a flower bed, what we initially get is almost a lawn of individual plants. But as they develop and grow through competition, they thin out into a lower number of larger plants that eventually go on to flower and reproduce. So self-thinning in plant populations is an example of exploitative competition occurring in nature. And interference competition in nature can be exemplified by competition between song sparrows. So male song sparrows are territorial. They keep a territory in which they kind of sing and display to attract females. But there are more males than there is space for territory. So around 20% of males don't have a territory, and we call these males floaters. And what they essentially do is just hang around waiting for those dominant males to die, or in some cases trying to attack them and take over their territories. So this aggressive behaviour between males is a good example of interference competition. But another thing that's interesting about these interactions between song sparrows is that the territorial males, or the dominant males, don't get attacked or challenged by the floaters in equal proportions across age ranges. So what this graph shows is the relationship between the age of the territory owner and the level of intrusion by floating males. So what it shows is that attacks by floating males on the territory owners are much higher in young individuals or young territory owners and very old territory owners. So these are the ones that seem to be more vulnerable to having their territory stolen from them. So what this basically shows is an example of interference competition that is not doesn't occur evenly across different age classes. So one thing that this kind of age-dependent variation in competition shows us is how complicated it's going to be to predict and model the effects of competition on populations. But over the years, many scientists have done this and have developed mathematical models to track competition and its effects on populations. And the most famous of those models is one developed by two scientists, Lotka and Volterra, and it's known as the Lotka-Volterra Model. So what Lotka and Volterra did was essentially expanded the logistic model of population growth that we studied in the last section to incorporate interspecific competition. So if you look at the logistic growth model, this final part of the equation is carrying capacity minus population over carrying capacity. So essentially what that part of the equation does is it models the environmental resistance to population growth. So as population gets nearer and nearer to carrying capacity, the growth of the population slows and eventually stops. So what that part of the equation is essentially modeling is intraspecific competition. So competition between individuals of the same species. And that competition increases in intensity as the population increases. So Lotka and Volterra expanded this model to allow us to predict changes in populations in response to competitive interactions between species, so interspecific interactions. In general, what the model predicts is that species will coexist when interspecific interaction or interspecific competition is less intense than intraspecific competition. So this is the expanded model developed by Lotka and Volterra. And what it essentially does is it allows us to use competition coefficients to model the effect of an individual of species 2 on the population growth of species 1, and separately the effect of an individual of species 1 on the population growth of species 2. So as well as mathematical models, there's a lot of great work that's been done to generate laboratory models of the effects of competition on populations. So the next couple of slides are going to describe some experiments done by G.F. Gorse with paramecia. So paramecia are single cellular flagellated organisms, aquatic organisms. Because they're so small, we can recreate their habitats really well in the lab in relatively small tanks. So these experiments were able to be replicated many times very efficiently. So Gorse worked with two species of paramecia, Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium aurelia, and he grew those species in the presence of two different concentrations of their food, which is the bacteria Bacillus paisaneus. So when he grew those species individually in the different mediums, what he found was that across the board those species grew well and showed this kind of sigmoidal curve shape of the logistic growth model. So essentially populations grew until they reached some carrying capacity, and where food was provided in higher concentrations, that carrying capacity was higher. So essentially what this showed was that when they were grown alone, these species' carrying capacity was determined by intraspecific competition. So what Gorse did next was to grow those two paramecium species together in those different mediums. And when he did that, what he found was that the population of Paramecium aurelia increased fairly rapidly, but the population of Paramecium caudatum declined, and they were eventually excluded from those environments. When the species were grown together in low food environments, the rate at which Paramecium caudatum declined was much faster, and in that case they actually went completely extinct from the medium. When food concentration was higher, it took much longer for the population of Paramecium caudatum to decline. And so what this shows us is that the intensity of interspecific competition is increased when resources are limited. So the results of these experiments by Gorse and also the predictions of the Lotka-Volterra model support competitive exclusion principle. So this is the idea that when two species are ecologically similar, so they're competing for the same food resources, the same nesting sites, etc., in that case the more competitive species will eventually exclude the less competitive one. So it will drive the less competitive species to at least local extinction. But as we know just from stepping outside, there are many situations that allow competing species to coexist. So what are the different criteria that allow that to happen? So the first of these kind of mechanisms for coexistence of similar species is spatial heterogeneity in resources. So we saw from the results of Gorse's experiments that the availability of food affected the speed with which Paramecium caudatum became extinct. So in high resource areas it took much longer. So one of the kind of requirements of exploitative competition is that resources have to be limited. So over the landscape where two species might co-occur, there are going to be areas of high resources and areas of low resources. And it may be that the more competitive species drives the less competitive species locally extinct in those low resource areas. But there are going to be high resource areas across the landscape where that shared resource isn't limiting and where both of those species are going to be able to coexist. So the second mechanism for coexistence is spatial heterogeneity in the strength of competition. So this is similar to the first one, but essentially the difference here is that availability of resources is not the only thing that affects the strength of competition. So across the landscape there's also going to be differences in rates of disease, in predation or parasitism, and these things are going to affect how strongly a certain species competes in these different areas. So across the landscape there are likely to be patches where some of these factors reduce the level of competition between species and allow for coexistence. Another mechanism that allows for coexistence of species is non-equilibrium conditions. So models like Lotka-Volterra assume that the competitive ability of a species remains constant through time. But of course that's not really the case in nature. So some species may become more competitive at different times of year, or as the climate changes, or as their population slowly rises. And so these shifts in competitive ability can allow for coexistence. Another way to take this point is to think that even if a species is slowly driving another one to local or complete extinction, that process isn't going to happen overnight. So sometimes when we see species coexisting, what we're seeing is really the process of an extinction, but that just takes time. So another potential mechanism is the incomplete exploitation of resources. So this is where two competing species or two species that compete for the same resources might reach their carrying capacity, but for reasons completely unrelated to that resource. So there might be two species of grazing animal that are under really intense predation pressure. And so it's that predation pressure that means that their populations can't reach a level where that resource is ever going to be limiting. And so for that reason, the two species can coexist happily without ever fully kind of exploiting that resource. So another mechanism would be competitive equivalence. So this is where two competing species are equally competitive. So in that case, the outcome of the competition is unpredictable, but on local scales, probably one species will outcompete the other and drive it locally extinct. But that will occur with the other species coming out on top in other areas. So on the landscape scale, those two species are going to be able to coexist. So the final mechanism is a variation in competitive ability within a species. So models like Lotka-Volterra will assume that the competitive ability of a species is a constant, whereas in fact, of course, that's not the case. The competitive ability of individuals within a species vary depending on environmental conditions like temperature and humidity, and we'll see an example of that in a second. But also, competitive ability might vary even with the genotype of the individual involved. So this variation in competitive ability within species was demonstrated really well by some work by Thomas Park, who studied competitive or competition between two species of flower beetle, so Tribolium confusum and Tribolium castaneum. So these are very small beetle species that persist in habitats as simple as a bag of flour. And so, again, like the paramecium that we looked at earlier in the lecture, they're really good study organisms for being able to kind of replicate experiments with populations on a really small scale. So these two species were first grown independently in bags of flour at 34 degrees C and 70% relative humidity. And when they were grown individually, these two species both thrived in those conditions. But when these two species were grown together in the same conditions, so 34 degrees C and 70% relative humidity, Tribolium castaneum thrived, but Tribolium confusum quickly went extinct. When the experiment was repeated, but this time in different conditions, so colder temperatures, 24 degrees C, and lower relative humidity, 30%, Tribolium confusum persisted in these conditions, but Tribolium castaneum this time became extinct very quickly. So what this shows us is that the outcome of competition is affected by the environmental conditions. So when you think about how conditions change when you do something as simple as, say, moving from the shade into the sun, if the outcome of competition changes so drastically in response to changes in conditions, then the kind of heterogeneity in conditions across the landscape should allow for the coexistence of many species. So one thing that allows for the coexistence of many species across a landscape is species shifting their niches in response to competition. So a niche is essentially the set of conditions under which a species can survive. And it can be described as fundamental niche. So this is the range of conditions under which a species can survive. And it can also be described as realized niche. So this is the range of conditions under which species are typically found. So usually, in many cases, the fundamental niche will be much broader than the realized niche. And that narrowing of the niche is a result of competition. So competition can have short-term effects on species distributions by restricting the realized niche. But strong, pervasive and persistent competition can actually lead to evolutionary responses and changes in the dimensions of the fundamental niche. And this is a concept that we'll come on to called character displacement. So this idea of fundamental niche and realized niche is demonstrated really well by the work on barnacles done by Joseph Connell, which we looked at in a previous lecture. So essentially Connell looked at two different species of barnacle, Chithamulus, which are the white ones, and Balanus, which are the brown ones, and I'll just refer to them in that way to keep it simple. Essentially the brown barnacles in this diagram are restricted to the lower part of the intertidal range because they're not very resistant to desiccation. But they're very competitive, and so their fundamental niche and realized niche is pretty much the same in this case. But in the case of the white barnacles, they don't occur lower down the intertidal range, because, as it turns out, they're outcompeted by the brown barnacles. So when Connell transplanted adult white barnacles into the range of those brown ones, those white barnacles did perfectly well there. It's just that juvenile white barnacles don't survive to adulthood in that area because they're outcompeted by the brown ones. So essentially, they could, in the absence of competition by the brown barnacles, exist over the whole range of that intertidal range. So that's their fundamental niche, but their realized niche is just the top portion of that, where they face less competition from the brown barnacles because those brown barnacles are less tolerant of desiccation, which occurs in the higher ranges. So environmental factors are what restricts populations of Balanus to the lower intertidal zone, but interspecific competition restricts Chithamulus, the white barnacles, to the upper intertidal zone. So I'm going to finish this lecture by talking about the concept of character displacement. So this is the idea that competition between species drives evolutionary changes in their fundamental niches, and so ultimately leads to speciation. So a classic example of this would be Darwin's finches. So they're very closely related species of finches in the Galapagos Islands that have obvious morphological differences. So large-beaked finches that are specialized on feeding on large seeds, very small-beaked birds that specialize in small seeds, and then kind of intermediate generalists. But a big question in ecology is competition the driving force between character displacement and speciation? So although there's a lot to suggest that competition is a driving force behind character displacement, there are very few experiments that kind of definitively show that. And that's because there are lots of criteria that any such experiment would have to fulfill. So conducting this kind of experiment is very difficult. So you'd have to show that phenotypic differences had a genetic basis. Phenotypic differences in sympatry should result from evolutionary shifts, not just the ability of similar sized species to coexist. So it should be to do with differences in resource use, not just some species becoming larger than another one in a given environment. So phenotypic differences should relate to resource use. Sites of sympatry and allopatry should be similar in the experiments, and there should be evidence that similar phenotypes actually compete for food. So one experiment that actually met all of those criteria was some really famous work done by Dolf Schluter on sticklebacks. So sticklebacks are small fish of which there are many co-occurring species. And they range morphologically based on the way that they use resources. So there are benthic species that look like the fish on the left of that diagram. So benthic species feed in the lower levels and almost the sediment of lakes. And then at the far end, other end of the spectrum are limnetic species. So these look morphologically like the fish on the right hand side. And they limnetic species, they feed in the kind of upper levels of lake environments. So what Schluter did was initially he grew a range of those stickleback species, ranging from benthic to limnetic in their morphology. He grew them individually in very similar lake environments. He found that when grown individually, their growth rates were independent of their phenotype. So different phenotypes grew roughly at equal rates. So what Schluter then did was he introduced that same range of species of sticklebacks to lakes that already had existing populations of limnetic species. So that species that's far on the right-hand side. And what Schluter found was that in those newly developed populations, the fish that grew best were the fish that were phenotypically furthest removed from the limnetic species. So when a range of species were introduced to lakes with limnetic species already present, it was the benthic species that grew at much faster rates. And this seemingly is because those benthic species were able to use the available resources differently. What this shows us is that within any environment, there's a selection pressure for species with divergent characteristics. So I'll finish with this example from Jonathan Losas, displaying the many different species of anoles in Florida. So these are very similar species of lizard that manage to co-occur by having just very, very slightly different niches. So there are slightly larger lizards that occur in the canopies of trees, feeding on larger insects. There are lizard species that are adapted to perching on small twigs that have shorter legs. There are lizards that perch on the sides of large trees that have larger legs and behave slightly differently when confronted with predators. They have a behavior called squirreling, where they kind of just skirt round the other side of the tree when they're threatened. There are species with much longer legs that occur on grasslands that are adapted to walking on grass. And so these tiny adaptations allow them to take up very slightly different niches that allow the co-occurrence of these many very similar species in a small area.